Welcome to Songs That Define Us. This is the podcast where we talk to progressive folks about music that has defined their outlook on life, their political views, their social views, maybe just a song that resonated with them, determining what they want to do with their life, whatever it may be. But we all know when we think about our history of ourselves, a lot of it is defined by some sort of soundtrack that has defined our outlook on life. And today we are joined by artist Eddie Colla. I first became aware of Eddie when I bought my Plasmatics poster that Eddie designed. But before that, I found out that Eddie was a music photographer and writer in the Bay Area. Started in Oakland, San Francisco, and was in the hip hop community and obviously the LGBTQ community. So Eddie, not sure if any of those areas, the music and the song that defined you came from, but welcome to the podcast, Eddie. If you can let us know what song defined you.
Well, thanks for having me. I thought about this for a long time because there was a lot of music that I was growing up with that was sort of what I would say when I was a kid was my parents' music. So it was in the background, but I don't know that I was ever actually conscious of it. There's a thing that happens when you're a little kid where you can hear a song and you can know all the lyrics and really never think about what it means. So I think the interesting thing about what you're talking about songs that define us, is that really it's sort of the intersection of what sort of passes through your experience at the same time that you've sort of crossed that threshold of being able to hear it. So that said, my song would be War Pigs by Black Sabbath. I don't think probably when people think of activist music, I don't think Black Sabbath probably ranks in the top 10. But that entire album, Paranoid, I acquired, I went out and bought it when I was about that age where I was starting to see a little bit beyond my neighborhood, my school, my family, my friends, into a little bit of a bigger worldview. And then, although the song, I think, was published in 1971 or something like that, I didn't come across it until the early 80s. And certainly, it was definitely, the Vietnam War was ever present from its end throughout the 80s, and so many films that were critical of it and whatnot. But I think it wasn't till I spent that certain amount of time when you're a teenager where you just sort of spend alone. I think it's a little bit different now because we have our phones that distract us. But when I was young and you bought a record, you were super excited. You brought it home. You put it on the turntable, and that's all it was. There was no multitasking. You read everything on the liner notes and you focused on the record and you intently sat there and listened to it for 45 minutes. And that was really the first time I can recall thinking all the sort of chatter I had heard about Vietnam, whether it was my parents sitting around the dining room table with their friends talking about the news, and I was sort of tuning it out because I was doing kid stuff, or it all sort of started to come back and sort of make sense. Oh yeah, this was probably my first conscious acknowledgement of this sort of class system. And it certainly went on from there. There were other songs that were in the sort of background of my childhood that you sort of say, well, what about Fortunate Son? Or, what about Blowing in the Wind? And it was just when I first heard those songs, I just wasn't there. I didn't have that early teenage absorption rate going for me. I was still in my early sort of earlier childhood. So, yeah, I heard them, but in a way, I didn't hear them.
Yeah, I remember I first became aware of War Pigs. I knew about it through Black Sabbath, but when Faith No More did the cover of it was kind of the first time that I really... but when you think of Ozzy Osbourne and Black Sabbath, and I remember an interview with Roger Daltrey from The Who talking about growing up in post-war World War II as well, right? So they had the rebuilding of their country at the same time this other war was going on. And here in America, we only kind of think of anti-war music from American artists. So it's interesting you kind of bring that one up, but also interesting in a way that heavy metal music a lot of times is singing about issues that are relevant in our society that kind of get overlooked as just noise or something else. And I'm glad you brought that one up and not something, no offense to CCR, some of the other more straight protest songs that are considered protest songs, but certainly Black Sabbath, that whole album was really around. And you mentioned the class aspect of it too, that obviously John Fogerty and CCR touched on, that you just maybe don't hear as much today.
No. And I mean, I think it's funny because when I go back and listen to that album now, like as a grown man, I think when I was young, it was very rebellious and it had all these very dark overtones. But when I listen to it now, it's like incognito sort of San Francisco protest music in a way. I mean, it's a little less optimistic, obviously, but in a way, it's the same thing. And I think it's always funny because, like you said, like heavy metal sort of gets categorized into this sort of area of. And when I was listening to it, this was the '80s, so I don't know if you remember the Satanic Panic.
Mhm.
So, the parents were up in arms that, these bands were trying to persuade their children into becoming Satanists and this and that. And I remember saying to people at the time, because, I grew up in New Jersey and went to Catholic schools, and people would say, well, how can you listen to that music? It's satanic. And I would take something like War Pigs and I would say, like, well, this is an anti-war song. So I don't know what's satanic about that. Like that seems right in line with everything you're kind of talking about. So I always thought that was kind of funny that in a way in America this image really sort of in some ways put the content in the shadows.
Yeah, and we see that even a lot within social movements. I do think there's a lot of bands out there creating a lot of good music. But back in the 70s, 80s, that music was readily available, was played on the radio. Those types of protest songs were popular music. Where now
Yeah.
you kind of have to go search for popular music. It is really not so much about social issues, lyrics. But I think that happens even with social movements here in America, where we take one person out of the crowd of a Black Lives Matter movement, and that becomes the movement, and sort of the messaging and everything else kind of gets lost based on an image or based on something that a group of people who may not agree with want to try to hijack what the message is. One of the things I see in your art, and for those who aren't familiar with Eddie, it's eddiecolla.com, EddieColla.com, is a lot of your images to me have a message of resilience, but also vulnerability. And I think that's what it takes is for people, it's okay to be vulnerable and to be able to stand up and fight back.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's accurate. I mean, I don't disagree. I mean, I'm glad that you said that because that's sort of where I'm aiming. In that, I think some people look at some of the images that I do and they think, well, it's a little bit dark, or they view it as slightly apocalyptic. But the thing I'm really trying to convey beyond that is that in a lot of the portraits that I do is sort of this idea that yeah, even in adversity, people find their strength, and sometimes it takes that adversity to find it. I would say probably part of the reason that I sort of approach things that way is because I found it to be true in my own life. I think for me, when everything is going fine and I'm comfortable and there's nothing wrong with that, it's great. But I do become a little bit complacent. And in that complacency, maybe I become a little bit disconnected from the community around me. But then when you go through something, a family member dies, there's addiction, it could be a divorce or some kind of a breakup or something where people really have to reshuffle their lives and do that. And I can't say what it is for everybody, but for me, those have always been the biggest periods of growth. I think when I'm content, which is great. I'm not I'm not in any way trying to push that. Oh, you have to suffer to make progress. I don't think that that's necessarily true. But for my personality, I tend to stagnate when everything's okay. And it's really not till life comes in and starts pushing me around that I start, well, I better get my shit together and figure out a way to push back. And that's sort of what I'm trying to tell people. Like, it's okay. Like, we're all gonna go through our sort of tussles, but you can win. Or even if you don't win, you can definitely stand up for yourself. And we don't win every one of those battles, but maybe in the end we win 7 out of 10.
And I think it's okay to go into a quote unquote battle and not win. In this society, I was having this conversation earlier, it seems like everything's kind of revolving around wins and losses and, did my team or my party win, rather than what does that mean? Nobody wins this life. So what do we do with the time we're here? But I think we've gotten to a point where everything has just become about wins and losses without understanding or maybe even knowing yourself what that may mean. And I do think there's something in your images that you can even feel. Maybe not everybody's going to win this battle, but they're having the battle. And that's really the important part.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's incredibly important. It's important for people to feel confident enough to be able to say, well, this opposition may have more money than me, and they may have more connections than me. But in my community, maybe collectively, we have more power than we think. If we can figure out a way to get along and present a sort of consolidated opposition, and that's again been true in my life. A year ago, I moved to Paris. But before that, I was involved in this long eviction process in Oakland that had to do with the legalization of cannabis. I mean, the city made a massive mistake and laid basically the area that the cannabis producers could produce right over where all the artist lofts were. So suddenly these buildings that were occupied by artists, simply because nobody had wanted them before, became extremely valuable. And then, of course, what followed was attempts to evict us. And in the end, we left. But I would say in the end, we did it on our terms. So did we win? No, I think maybe our community, our art community that had been there for 40 years would have preferred to stay. But we really would have got run out of town with nothing had we not, as tenants, organized and grouped together in opposition to the property owners. Because in the end, what we had was this consolidated front where it was like, look, you either get none of us or all of us, but you're going to have to do it in a way that we feel is fair. And really what they wanted to do, and what was evident, was they wanted to pick us off one at a time and tried to do that. But luckily, the group had faith in the group itself. And they thought, no, if we just stick together, we're going to get a lot further than if we splinter off into separate groups. And it worked to everybody's benefit. There's some things in life that we can't prevent exactly. So we can't prevent the changing real estate dynamics in the Bay Area. But what we could do is we could make sure that the tenants could leave in some kind of a financial situation that allowed them to start over again somewhere else without being in a massive financial hole, etc.
Going back to the song War Pigs, and really, I think that whole album, a lot of Black Sabbath stuff, there's a lot of quote unquote blue collar working class themes to a lot of their early music. Obviously, they were working class guys, come from working class families. But when you were in the Bay Area, covering hip hop as a music photographer and writer, and then also San Francisco doing a lot of the LGBTQ movement and music there, most folks may not see a direct connection between those two, right? But I would argue that really any marginalized group tends to have a lot more in common than different. Sometimes those sort of differences are heightened maybe by others who have no real interest in seeing folks come together. But what was your sense of being in those two communities, being in other communities? How much of a similarity did you see with that? So did you see a lot of
the Bay Area always had, it wasn't the whole, because Los Angeles and places like New York were obviously bigger markets, but the Bay Area definitely had its hip hops. And to just be in that and be a part of that, first of all, the best thing in the world about being an artist is you have the ability to move through the world a little bit differently than most people. There's some quote about artists are one of the few populations that can mix with all classes, and to some degree it's true because of the work that you're doing. You end up, in my whole life as an artist, I've met people and been part of situations that I never would have had access to if it wasn't for the fact that I was there to take a photo or make some art or whatever. And it's really probably the best thing I can say about being an artist, to be involved in the hip hop movement in the Bay Area, in that period of time, which was, in the time that I was doing it was like all throughout the mid 90s to the early 2000s. And also in the LGBT community in San Francisco, because I was working with publications over there And then, there was the whole Proposition 8 thing in California. We did a big street campaign against that. And just in a way where it wasn't any different than War Pigs. It was just sort of like, oh, yeah, this is the same dynamic that's going on. There's a group of people who have power, and they're going to pick on a group of people that they feel don't have power. Like I said, there are battles that you lose, but through my experience, I've always thought like people like to say like, oh, the odds are against us. In my life, I would say that that's an underestimation. I would say that the odds are at least 50-50. For the time being, there are still ways to address abuses of power. There are no quick fixes, but there is still a tremendous ability in the United States for somebody of literally no consequence to confront people who are very, very powerful and have some effect. And I know that it seems like quite often we are being bullied around by corporations or we're being spied on by social media. And I'm not saying that those things aren't true, but if you really focus your energy and be unwavering in it, you can get somewhere. We had a series of problems in the building that we eventually got evicted from. But for about 2 years, the entire building was being run on diesel generators because just because the owners were so unorganized, they never sort of had any foresight as to how much power the building was going to need to be able to cultivate cannabis. And so they just put in these tractor trailer sized diesel generators, and there were about 12 of them, and they create an enormous amount of pollution. And this was in East Oakland, which is historically a redlined community. And what they were doing was 100% illegal by half a dozen laws. And they just did it. And we sort of contacted the city and said, hey, they're not allowed to do that. And the city said, yeah, well, I mean, it's complicated, you know. And literally, the tenants spent about 2 years going from agency to agency and not letting them off the hook and continually complaining. And eventually, what ended up happening is the state and the city, sort of in coordination, did step in and have those generators removed from the community. And they were creating terrible air quality. I mean, the location of the building was like 1,800 feet from a primary school. So it's just inexcusable, especially in California, which claims to be, the green state, so forward thinking. And my point is this: if we had given up in the first month, we would have said, oh, we told everybody at the city, we told the mayor's office, we told the fire department. Nobody did anything, which was true. Initially, they didn't do anything, but we just never stopped. And eventually, what happened was the guys who owned the building had all those generators removed and went bankrupt. I mean, if a handful of artists who were just literally making phone calls and sending emails basically bankrupt a bunch of millionaires, it's possible. You can kind of take on these things. They tend to be long battles, and that's the game plan. They try to wear you down. We're going to exhaust you until you give up. I mean, I feel like that's exactly what's happening in the whole country right now. Donald Trump's going to show up and he's going to do more outrageous things than you can be shocked about in the first month. And everybody's just going to go, oh, God, I wish this would just end and tune out. And he's going to walk away with the keys to the palace.
And I think that's where art can be so critical. And you mentioned a little bit ago about kind of battling corporations. And when Walmart was selling art, prints, or whatever that they claimed to be were Banksy's, and one of them was one of your pieces, which is strange for like a gazillion-dollar company to try to make money off independent artists like that. But was that something that you were aware of? Because on one hand, you could be like flattered, like, oh, that's nice. They think I'm Banksy, but like, come on, like, I'm trying to make a living here.
Right. And also, Walmart has plenty of money. They certainly don't need to infringe on independent artists' copyrights to make more money. But I think it's just that thing where they think like they're just beyond reproach. But again, it was sort of like a buddy of mine sent me a link and he said, oh, hey, I saw this on the Walmart site. And do you know about this? And I was like, nah, I don't know about it, So, I contacted through another artist, recommended sort of an intellectual property guy. And I said, well, you think you can do something about this? And he said, yeah, I could probably do something about it. We'll see, But in the meantime, what I did was I didn't say anything about it for about 3 weeks. I did a release with 1X Run, and then I did sort of an illegal mural in San Francisco that both sort of mentioned Walmart and released both of them on Cyber Monday. And just sort of by fluke at the time, I just put them out there in the morning on Cyber Monday, and they got picked up by like Newsweek and BuzzFeed. And I mean, it was just all over the place. Like in a matter of hours, it was just everywhere. So I think it embarrassed them, and then they settled for a certain amount of money. And I sort of thought, well, that was fair. And they took it down. But again, you could just say, you could shrug your shoulders and say, well, it's fucking Walmart. What am I going to do? But this was a lawyer that, I didn't have any money at the time. This was a lawyer who agreed to do it on a contingency basis. And it was effective and we won, or at least we got treated fairly. It's unfortunate. I think part of the problem with artists is some artists get copied so much that it's a full-time job just to fight all these things. And so companies know that they sort of get away with a lot of stuff. But I would say, I mean, it's worth standing up for yourself, maybe even if you have to hire some part-time person to just write emails for you, or find a decent attorney who'll take care of some of it for you. Or, here in France is sort of an artist's legal cooperative that you can join for very, very little money, and they'll sort of represent you in that sense. But there are a handful of companies that I would say, like Etsy and Amazon, that really kind of function in this outside of the law, really. Most companies, if you send them a cease and desist and show them that this is actually copyrighted work, they will go, okay, our bad, and they'll back off. Amazon, Etsy, it's just there is a little bit of that arrogance with them. Now, I haven't made a concerted effort to go after either one of them, but I would say that anybody listening to this, don't be discouraged by that characterization. I'm not saying they can't be taken down or at least dented. They probably can be. I just have not gone after them. But I had some success with Walmart.
And the image we're talking about is if you want to achieve greatness, stop asking for permission. And that's,
which they seem to take a little bit too literally.
Which is such a great image, but it's one of the few that I can recall of yours where there's sort of a direct message kind of written out there, right? A lot of your art, at least that I'm aware of, is very visual, not as much
with the text, yeah.
With the text to it. And was that an earlier piece?
It kind of was an earlier piece. And what it was just, it's a funny thing, at one point I had this clothing company and I was doing t-shirts and stuff like that. I was doing some street art, but I wasn't exhibiting like at galleries or, any of that. I was making my money off of selling t-shirts. I was doing street art because I love doing street art. And I got offered an exhibition and just, I was like, yeah, I'll do it. This guy said, oh, you want to do an exhibition at the space? And I said, yeah, I'll do it. And then, of course, immediately thought, I have no idea what that would do for an exhibition. And it was very like in the near future. It was like a month away. I just went into a panic. And I was like, I told this guy to do this exhibition. So I'm panicking and I'm running in 5 different directions at once. And I had this friend who worked for me at the time at the t-shirt company, like super even-keeled guy, didn't really get flustered. So I would always go to him for advice because I could kind of count on him kind of having a clear mind. And I had like written on a napkin on my desk this little thing that said, if you want to achieve greatness, stop asking for permission. So I'm going through all this on my computer and I'm showing him all these mock-ups. And he's like, yeah, that's okay. That's okay. And then he picks up the napkin and he's like, what's this? And he's like, he's like, do that. And he just throws the napkin at me. And I was like, well, that's just a sentence. And he's like, yeah, I don't know, make an image and go with it. That's good. So I think the lesson there is that, pays off to have good friends. Because I probably never would have done it. It was just like literally like a note to myself. I wrote, oh, this thing down. Blah, blah, blah. And he's like, no, just make an image to go with it. And that's people will like people will understand that. Like that will resonate with people. I said, really? I don't know. I think it's kind of long and wordy, And he was like, nah, it doesn't matter. Just do it. So I took his advice. It was sound advice. He's the same guy who I had done a bunch of posters for Obama when Obama was running for president in 2008. Same thing. Had a bunch of things on my computer. He came in, we worked together. He came in, saw this thing one day, and he's like, "Oh, what are you doing, an Obama poster?" And I was just like, "Ah, you know." And he's like, "No, you got to make shirts of that." And I was like, "You think?" And he was like, "Yeah, yeah, you totally got to make shirts of that." She started making these shirts. I mean, they were selling out quicker than we could make them. I mean, one of them, Spike Lee was on CNN wearing one of our shirts. And we were like, it wasn't like we were a big brand. We were literally like working out of a warehouse in Oakland, and somehow he got a hold of one of them. He did this whole interview on CNN wearing one of the shirts. And again, it's just one of those things like never underestimate like where you can end up if you just do the right thing. And in doing that, we were able to raise, I mean, I think we donated like $45,000 or something just by selling t-shirts. Probably more money than I made that year. I mean,
But it's interesting, obviously the podcast songs that define us. I think there's something about a song that just sticks with you in a much more, I don't want to say visceral way, but you just tend to remember it more. But I do think it's amazing how images really shape cultural movements. It's certainly not talked about as much, right? Nobody's really saying, oh, that Shepard Fairey poster really helped get Obama, right? Nobody really talks about it that way. But I do think your T-shirt and art and Shepard Fairey and all these other artists coming out and giving visual recognition to people who may not be able to put those things together themselves in some form or fashion is an amazing, just, I don't want to say talent, but just to be able to do that in a way that like a song can do and it sticks with you. But I think for some reason, it just seems like art doesn't quite have that same staying power, or you don't recognize it maybe as having that as a song does. But I do think art has as much of a influence on our cultural outlook as maybe music does.
I think it can. There is something about one's reaction to music that seems to be almost chemical. When you start to hear a piece of music, either that you really love or that really moves you, it kind of just washes over you. And I think that can happen with visual art, but I don't think we're as sensitive to it. Even, I mean, I'm an artist. I can go to museums. I can see pieces that I probably looked at in books all my life, and here I am. I'm in front of the thing, and it is like it's an experience. But I don't know that it has the same impact as the way a song would move me. And I think maybe that's just a limitation to the visual arts in some way. I mean, I think throughout history you see that. That's why I think music is so much a part of cultural gatherings because it has that part of it. And art is a part of that too. But I think visceral is kind of the right word. The reaction is that intense. And also I think there's sort of a sense memory that goes along with music. Occasionally I'll catch a song on the radio or something or in passing, or I'll be in a supermarket and it'll be some song from when I was 14 or 15 in that real high absorption, stage of life. And bam, man, like you're right back there. It's almost like when you smell something, like when you smell something from when you're a kid, like some kind of food your mom used to make or something. It's like this transporter just brings you right back there. And that's the thing I think about music also. When I was a kid, also, because media was more limited. So when I was growing up, I mean, music was really one of the singular ways you would define your place in school or in your neighborhood or whatever. That's how we kind of tribalized, right? Now there's lots of ways.
Yeah, unfortunately, too many, I think, online anyway.
Yeah, too many choices to just cause stress.
And too many people who are so easy to find who may believe the same wacky theory you do, and now you have a movement where before you may have been only one or two in your entire town to believe some crazy thing, but now you can find 4,000 people online, and now you have a movement.
Yeah, like in terms of like conspiracy folks and things like that. Yeah, like I mean, even growing up, I remember guys, just even in the community where I lived, and they would talk this crazy, and everybody would just say, "Come on, man, you're being ridiculous." But right now, you can go on Facebook and find 5,000 other people who are affirming that belief.
And you mentioned war, and you talk about like you weren't really aware of like the Vietnam War the way it was at the time, but were your parents active at all and protesting at all? Or do you think that song was a reflection of maybe their beliefs too, or do you think that was just something you really kind of found on your own?
I mean, it's funny because my parents got divorced when I was about 9 or 10. My father really worked kind of in corporate America. I would say in retrospect, he did it half-heartedly. I think there was a part of him that always was sort of like, eh. At the same time, this was a different generation, so he was a guy who at 30 years old had 4 kids and a mortgage. So I think he had a lot of obligations. He very much liked drawing and making art. And when I was young, actually encouraged me to do that. He never encouraged me to follow his path, quite the opposite. After they got divorced, my mom went back to school and actually worked basically as a social worker for the rest of her life. And for a couple of decades, ran a big community action in Vermont and worked as a social worker in all kinds of hospitals and elderly care stuff and things like that. But when I was a kid, I think they were so busy like raising 4 kids that they were just kind of in that, like, I got to go to work. Da, da, da. They weren't necessarily politically active that I remember, but it may just be that I wasn't in tune to what they were talking about after we went to bed.
Where do you think your activism came from then? If it's not if you can't find that direct correlation, is it just seeing things around you? Do you think songs like War Pigs had a real direct correlation to it? Or do you?
I think there was definitely that. And like I said, that was sort of the beginning. That's the first instance where I can really sort of think like I was sitting there going, oh, yeah, that's how this works. That's how these kind of groups sort of play off of each other. That's how one group of people use it. That's how these things happen. And then certainly after that, I mean, I could go on with tons of other songs like Sympathy for the Devil, or The Alarm had an album called Declaration, which was super like, the whole album was kind of like this revolutionary anthem. So it just continued throughout my teen years. And I don't know what it was. I mean, I just always saw a lot of injustice in the way certain people were treated, or the way people were just treated for being different. I mean, I always found it to be true that if you stand up to bullies, they just crumble. And I think I just carried that into adulthood. And I mean, that's like I said, I was never in a union because I always kind of worked for myself. I didn't really work for bigger companies, but even when I was like sort of a contractor, a handyman, I was always working for myself. So there's nobody to unionize. Nobody was pulling the purse strings on what I was doing. I was sort of independent. But, I mean, I was always thought, well, that's exactly how you get somewhere. I mean, because in the end, the workers, I mean, that's where the power is.
Did you stop doing sort of the photography and stuff and start pursuing more visual arts and painting? And was that a decision because you wanted something different to say? What made that transition from saying, I'm now going to go from, photography and being in the music industry, going from there to saying, I'm now going to be kind of a full-time visual artist with paintings?
I mean, it all kind of, I mean, it's like most things in life. It just kind of, it wasn't really planned and it just kind of happened. But when the opportunity presented itself, I've been working as a photographer for like 10 or 12 years. And when I started out as a photographer, I was doing more journalistic stuff. Like I was a freelancer for the New York Times for a while. So it was really, I was documenting things. Didn't have anything to do with what I thought. But when I started doing work for magazines, I think it was great for a while. I got to meet a lot of interesting people. I got to go to a lot of interesting places. But I think after about like 10 years, it was sort of this thing where you sit back and you say, okay, like this is cool and I'm making a living. But I think the thing that hit me was like, I think what I do for a living is I make things look better than they are. I make people look more attractive than they are. I make places seem better than they are. Occasionally I make products look better than they are, and I sort of thought, well, that's not why I started doing this. When you're young and you're an artist, you're kind of like, well, if I can find work, that's great. But, the older you get, you sort of like, okay, well, what am I doing? Am I playing into that hand? So I ended up thinking like, oh, in some way, like really as a photographer, when you're a commercial photographer, you're a little bit like a professional liar. You're like a hype man. You're making all these products or music or people or whatever seem better than they are. And I thought, yeah, that's not exactly what I want to do. And at the same time, I had started this very small sort of niche clothing market, but it started to make money. So I thought, well, this would be great. I mean, it would really be great if I didn't have to photograph these people or these things and make them appear better than they are. If I just had total control and there were no art directors and no PR people and I could just do what I wanted and still make money. And luckily, I was just fortunate enough to be able to do that at the time. Like as soon as I got total control, it was like, yeah, I can't really go back to the other thing.
Were your images, going back to the very early portion of the conversation where I at least gave my impression of sort of this vulnerability and defiance all in one. Was that always the image you had, message, or what you wanted to try to get across in your image? Was that defined over time?
I don't know. I was always kind of an anti-authoritarian person, and I can't even attribute that to anything. I feel like I was born that way because it goes so far back. Like I can just remember being very confrontational, defiant, like in kindergarten. Which doesn't make a lot of sense. But yeah, I mean, I don't know why I've always been, but I have always been that way. And so I think when I started making images, it was sort of this thing. And also when I started making images, I was young. And so like a lot of young people, I had a chip on my shoulder. So I thought, oh, the world is out to get me, and I need to, stand up for myself and make a statement. And so I think a lot of my images were me channeling my own insecurities through the images. Like you have to be tough, you have to stand up. So I always tried to portray people in the images as doing just that in a visual sense, being like monolithic, just even in their posturing.
And you also have a very diverse looking each of your art, it's not, a lot of times with artists, they want to capture some sort of traditional, quote unquote, traditional beauty, some quote unquote traditional form that fits the narrative of what female should look like, a male should look like. But yours are all over the place, not just in diversity in sizes and genders and ethnicities, but there's always this common thing, right? Like no matter who they are, we're all kind of struggling through this thing together. And I think that's what I find so inspiring is, you're not just picking one group of people and saying, oh, this is the group whose throat is being stepped on. It's like, this is happening to all of us. And we all need representing this because that's kind of how, when we all come together, there's probably no stronger force, whether it's your tenants that came together in San Francisco, workers who come together at the workplace, or us as society coming together against a few billion.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's true. And one of the things that I intentionally tried to do in recent years with the work is that a lot of the people who are models are some form of multi-ethnic because sort of as we move forward, right, this is what happens. We all, we're not in our own little sects, where, oh, this is an Irish neighborhood with Irish kids, and that's an Italian neighborhood with Italian kids, and that's a Jewish neighborhood over there. More and more, at least in the United States, we become multi-ethnic, and that will continue to happen. And I think it's a good thing, and it's certainly. But the reason I was doing that is I was sort of trying to project those images into the future, and to my mind, that's what the future looks like. The future doesn't look exactly where we're at now, but it certainly becomes more multi-ethnic. And living in the Bay Area, it's just sort of a very multi-ethnic community. So there's all kinds of people who are mixed race, etc. So that's that. And then, I tried as best I could with, now, I don't really get models to do any of this stuff. Most of the people that you see in my work are just people that I know or people that I'm friends with or friends of friends. And then also for me, the challenge is as an artist is, so I did an exhibit in Paris just before the pandemic. And I showed up in Paris like 6 weeks before the exhibit.